Just kidding. Yes, I'm starting out with an ad. Just get it out of the way. I'm kind of curious what the ads are, so. Beeloo. We're going to go ahead and go to the just chatting screen. Meanwhile, the ads are rolling. What ads do we have? The ant infestation. Okay, yeah. Getting those ads out of the way. 15, 14. Oh, look, it says we're live. Imagine that. Yes, we are live. I do have Streamloots now. I don't really have anything set up. It would be easier for when you're playing games, but because I can't switch weapons when I'm reading a book. That would just be awkward. But anyway, I'm going to check to make sure all the posting and stuff happened, because not really trusting Stream Elements of late. So I want to make sure it posted to Twitter. This standard message, there we go. Okay. I'm going to copy the link and put it underneath the original. So I will put that on there. Yeah, well, that didn't do anything. So, yeah. But anyway, it is announced that I'm here. I'm here. I kind of give up on trying to post everything to Discord, because I can't even keep track of my own Discord, honestly. But hey, that's what we do here. We are here to tell stories. Yes, that is what we do. Oh, that's what I do. Hopefully you guys listen. I mean, I can't guarantee that you listen, but I am here. So, how was everyone's week? Been kind of a slow one, but it's almost over for all you working people out there. I guess it's almost over. I don't know if you work weekends or not. I don't. I'm going to try to do some more game streams, but I will keep my regular scheduled stories. I may end up playing Fable again tomorrow because people like Fable, and it's, Fable, story based, so it's something I would do. But let's see, it is only 9:01, so you got a little while before I go ahead and crack open the book. We are doing fairy tales again tonight, out of the Beauty and the Beast and Other Classic Fairy Tales book. So I hope you all enjoy it when I get into it. But again, we've still got a few minutes to go, and let's see if our sound alerts are going to bother working today or not. I don't think they will. I'm tempted to just scrap the whole thing, but well, it tried. And I jumped. So I guess technically the jump scare worked. But, you know. I would say that I'm thinking about getting more art done, but honestly, I don't have the money. I'm trying to get some comics sold right now so I can get some more funds. To try this one, that. Then I'll try it again using points. I do not hear my woo. So I will. Why do I have it? Oh, I turned off the points alert because of it. Let me turn those back on. Let's check. Oh, yeah, the woo's turned off. Okay. Turn them back on. I want to know if this one works because I really like this one. I want it to work. Oh, that one didn't work, so turn them back off. Real wish those things would work. I'd like to figure out why they're not working, but I don't really feel like I have the patience to fix it myself. Let's see, you got 905. So, what's up in the world? How are you doing? I got at least 2 people that I'm following that are doing sub streams right now. I will shut them out. If I can spell she's right. Let's see, Jesus World 91, I believe. Yes, so give him a shout out. Show anything in the room? That doesn't show anything in the chat when I do that. Interesting to know, though. I'm going to try the regular shout out. Jesus World 91. Yeah, they're still playing Elden Ring, so always good in the world. And of course, the lovely Minka. I can't type. Mina. Manaka Wolf. Okay, I should really remember that. They are also doing their own subathon. Oh, they're playing Amogus. Nice to know. Amogus. I need to set up that auto shout-out for Shizu. I'll get to that eventually. I want to do auto shout-outs for all my VIPs. Of course, Fosabot is not that great at doing shoutouts. I'm going to try. I can shout out Guilty. Just type his name. Oh, well, I picked it up that time. But yeah. I'll try to set up the auto shoutouts for you guys. I have to wait how long? Okay. I was just checking to see what the timer is. I guess I can just leave it on that screen. But anyway, how's everyone doing? Guess I've said that a couple times now, but I just want to know how you guys are. Because I really do care about you guys. I mean, I like telling you guys stories and reading stories to you guys, and well, I just really do want you to enjoy the stories as much as I enjoy telling them. Because I really do enjoy telling the stories, and because it's fun, really. But anyway, it is still got 2 minutes left to go. But let's go ahead and switch over to the screen. So if you'll meet me over in the reading area. Cool, cool. I'll try not to look down at the book so much, because honestly, I like to keep some kind of eye contact. And just storytellers got to talk to their audience, as we're here to tell you stories. I know I'm not the only storyteller out there. There's lots of us. I've made friends with a few of them. I know there's more that I haven't seen and haven't caught, but I really do try to catch as many people's story times as I can. I do still try to have that um, voting thing. I haven't gone to check it for a while, but I've been trying to get a story reading channel set up, but it just hasn't happened yet. I really would like to have one, but you know, it takes more than the people that I have signing it so far to get it done, so it would be genuinely nice if we could get it. That way, if people want to find someone that's just reading stories, they could just look for people reading stories. Because ASMR is all fun and good. Just chatting, yeah. Story time was a very weird ass game that I did find and I did play, and it was weird. But yeah, it's not exactly a game I would recommend. But that's what story time is tied to right now. So, seeing as we have hit the time, I will get the book open. Find the nice little ribbon bookmark that came with it. Okay. And I'm going to try to do at least 4 or 5 stories, at least. It depends on if we have another case of Scheherazade rambling. So, our first story The Boys with the Golden Stars, from the Violet Fairy Book. Once upon a time, what happened did happen. And if it had not happened, you would never have heard this story. Well, once upon a time, there lived an emperor who had half a world all to himself to rule over. And in this world dwelt an old herd and his wife, and their 3 daughters, Anna, Stana, and Laptisa. Anna, the eldest, was so beautiful that when she took the sheep to the pasture, they forgot to eat as long as she was walking with them. Stana, the second, was so beautiful that when she was driving, the flock of wolves protected the sheep. But Laptitsa, the youngest, with a skin as white as the foam on milk, and with hair as soft as the finest lamb's wool, was both beautiful as her sisters put together. As beautiful as she alone could be. One fine summer day, when the rays of the sun were pouring down on the earth, the three sisters went into the wood on the outskirts of the mountain to pick strawberries. They were looking about to find where the largest berries grew, and they heard the tramp of horses approaching, so loud that you would have thought a whole army was riding by. But it was only the Emperor going to hunt with his friends and attendants. They were all fine, handsome young men, who sat their horses as if they were part of them. But the finest and handsomest of all was the young Emperor himself. As they drew near the three sisters, they marked their beauty. They checked their horses, and they rode slowly. "Listen, sisters," said Anna, as they passed on. "If one of those young men should make me his wife, I would bake him a loaf of bread which they should keep him young and brave forever." "And if I," said Stana, "should be the one chosen, I would weave my husband a shirt which would keep him unscathed when he fights with dragons. When he goes through water, he will never even be wet, or if through fire, it will not scorch him." "And I," said Latissa, "will give the man who chooses me 2 boys, twins, each with a golden star on his forehead as bright as those in the sky." And though they spoke low, the young men heard, and turned their horses' heads. "I will take you at your word, and mine you shall be, most lovely of empresses," cried the Emperor, and he swung Laptiza and her strawberries on the horse before him. "And I will have you." "And I you," exclaimed 2 of his friends, and they all rode back to the palace together. The following morning the marriage ceremony took place, and for 3 days and 3 nights there was nothing but feasting over the whole kingdom. And when the rejoicings were over, the news was that everybody's mouth that Anna had sent for corn, and had made a loaf of which she had spoken at the strawberry beds. And then more days and nights passed, and this rumor was succeeded by another one, that Stana had procured some flax, and had dried it, and combed it, and spun it into linen, and sewed it herself into the shirt of which she had spoken in the strawberry fields. Now the Emperor, who had a stepmother, and she had a daughter by her first husband, who lived with her in the palace. The girl's mother had always believed that her daughter would be empress, and not the milk-white maiden, the child of a mere shepherd. She hated the girl with all her heart, and only bided her time to do her ill. But she could do nothing as long as the Emperor remained with his wife night and day, and she began to wonder what she could do to get him away from her. At last, when everything else had failed, she managed to make her brother, who was king of a neighboring country, stretching out, declare war against the Emperor and besiege some of the frontier towns with a large army. This time her scheme was successful. The young emperor sprang up in wrath the moment he heard the news, and vowed that nothing, not even his wife, should hinder him giving them battle. And hastily assembling whatever soldiers happened to be at hand, he set off at once to meet the enemy. The other king had not been so swift in his movements, and was not ready to receive him. The emperor fell on him when he was off his guard, and routed his army completely. Then, when victory was won, and the terms of peace hastily drawn up, he rode home as fast as his horse could carry him, and reached the palace on the third day. But early that morning, when the stars were glowing pale in the sky, two little boys with golden hair and stars on their foreheads were born to Leptitsa. And the stepmother, who was watching, took them away and dug a hole in the center of the palace, under the windows of the emperor, and put them in it. While their heads stayed, she placed two little puppies. The emperor came into the palace, and when they told him the news, he went straight to Laptitsa's room. No words were needed. He saw his own eyes that Laptitsa had not kept his promise. She had made the strawberry beds, and, though it nearly broke his heart, he must give orders for her punishment. So he went out sadly and told his guards that the empress was to be buried up in the earth up to her neck, so everyone might know what would happen to those who dared to deceive the emperor. Now, many days after, the stepmother's wish was fulfilled. The emperor took her daughter to wife, and again the rejoicings lasted for 3 days and 3 nights. Now, let us see what happened to the little boys. The poor little babies had found no rest, even in their graves. In the place where they had been buried, there sprang up 2 beautiful young aspens. And the stepmother, who hated the sight of trees, which reminded her of her crime, gave orders that they should be uprooted. But the emperor heard of it and forbade the trees to be touched, saying, "Let them alone. I like to see them there. They're the finest aspens I have ever beheld." And the aspens grew as no aspens had ever grown before. And each day they added another year's growth. And each night they added a year's growth. And at dawn, when the stars faded out of the sky, they grew 3 years' growth in the twinkling of an eye, and their boughs swept across the palace windows. And when the wind moved them softly, the emperor would sit and listen to them all day long. The stepmother knew what it all meant, and her mind never ceased from trying to invent some way of destroying the trees. It was not an easy thing, but a woman's will can press milk out of a stone, and her cunning will overcome heroes. What craft will not do soft words may maintain, but if these did not succeed, there still remains the resource of tears. One morning the empress sat on the edge of her husband's bed and began to coax him with all sorts of pretty ways. It was some time before the bait took, but at length even emperors are only men. "Well, well," he said at last, "have your way and cut down the trees, but on one they shall make a bed for me, and out of the other one for you." And with the next day, the Empress was forced to be content. The aspens were cut down the next morning, and before night, the new bed had been placed in the Emperor's room. Now, when the Emperor lay down on it, it seemed as if he had grown 100 times heavier than usual. Yet he felt a kind of calm that was quite new to him. But the Empress felt as if she were lying on thorns and nettles, and could not close her eyes. When the Emperor was fast asleep, the bed began to crack loudly. And to the Empress, each crack had a meaning. She felt as if she were listening to a language which no one but herself could understand. "It is too heavy for you, little brother?" asked one of the beds. "Oh, no, it is not heavy at all," answered the bed in which the Empress was sleeping. "I feel nothing but joy now that my beloved father rests over me." "It is very heavy for me," said the other bed, "for on me lies an evil soul." And so they talked on till morning, the Empress listening the whole time. By daybreak, the Empress had determined how to get rid of the beds. She would have 2 others made exactly like them, and when the Emperor had gone hunting, they should be placed in the room. This was done, and the aspen beds were burnt in a large fire, till only a little heap of ashes was left. While they were burning, the Empress seemed to hear the same words which she alone could understand. Then she stopped and gathered up the ashes and scattered them to the 4 winds, so that they might blow over fresh lands and fresh seas, and nothing remain of them. But she had not seen that where the fire burnt brightest, 2 sparks flew up, and after floating on the air for a few moments, fell down into the great river that flows through the heart of the country. Here the sparks had turned into 2 little fishes with golden scales, and one was so exactly like the other that everyone could tell at the first glance that they must be twins. Early one morning, the Emperor's fishermen went down to the river to get some fish for their master's breakfast, and cast their nets into the stream. As the last star twinkled out of the sky, they drew them in, and among the multitude of fishes lay 2 with golden scales, such as no man had ever looked on. They all gathered around and wondered, and after some talk they decided that they would take the little fishes alive as they were, and give them as a present to the Emperor. "Do not take us there, for that is whence we came, and yonder lies our destruction." Ooh, thank you. "But what are we to do with you?" asked the fisherman. "Go and collect all the dew that lies on the leaves, and let us swim in it. Then lay us in the sun, and do not come near us till the sun's rays have all dried off the dew," answered the other fish. The fishermen did as they told them, gathered the dew from the leaves, and let them swim in it, and then put them to lie in the sun till the dew should be all dried up. And when he came back, what do you think he saw? Why, 2 boys, 2 beautiful young princes, with hair as golden as the stars on their foreheads, and each so like the other that at the first glance everyone would have known them for twins. The boys grew up fast, and every day they grew a year's growth, and in every night another year's growth, and at dawn, when the stars were fading, they grew 3 years' growth in the twinkling of an eye. and they grew in each other's height as well. Thrice in age, thrice in wisdom, and thrice 12 years in age, 24 in strength, and 36 in wisdom. Good stat rolls. Now take us to our father, they said. So the fishermen gave them each a lambskin cap which covered their faces, and completely hid their golden hair and the stars on their foreheads, and led them to court. By the time they arrived there, it was midday, and the fisherman and his charges went up to an official who was standing about. "We wish to speak to the emperor," said one of the boys. "You must wait until he has finished his dinner," replied the porter. "No, while he is eating," said the second boy, stepping across the threshold. The attendants all ran forward to thrust such impudent youngsters outside the palace, but the boys slipped through their fingers like quicksilver and entered a large hall where the emperor was dining, surrounded by his whole court. "We desire to enter," said one of the princes sharply to a servant who stood near the door. "That is quite impossible," replied the servant. "Is it? Let us see," said the second prince, pushing the servants to the right and left. But the servants were many, and the princes only two. There was a noise of a struggle which reached the emperor's ears. "What's the matter?" asked he angrily. The princes stopped at the sound of their father's voice. "Two boys want to force their way in," replied one of the servants, approaching the emperor. "To force their way in? Who dares to use force in my palace? What boys are they?" said the emperor, all in one breath. "We know not, O mighty emperor," answered the servant, "but they must surely be akin to you, for they have the strength of lions, but have scattered the guards at the gate, and they are as proud as they are strong, for they will not take off their caps from their heads." The emperor, as he listened, grew red with anger. "Thrust them out," cried he. "Set the dogs after them." "Leave us alone, and we will go quietly," said the princes, and stepped backwards, weeping silently at the harsh words. They had almost reached the gates when a servant ran up to them. "The emperor commands your return," he panted. "The empress wishes to see you." The princes thought for a moment. Then they went back the way they had come, and walked straight up to the emperor, their caps still on their heads. He sat on top of a long table covered with flowers, and filled with guests. And beside him sat the empress, supported by 12 cushions. Big butt. When the princes entered, one of the cushions fell down, and there remained only 11. "Take off your caps," said one of the courtiers. "A covered head is among men a sign of honor. We wish to seem that what we are." "Never mind," said the emperor, whose anger had dropped before the silvery tones of the boy's voice. "Stay as you are, but tell me who you are. Where do you come from, and what do you want?" "We are twins, two shoots from one stem, which has been broken, and half lies on the ground and half sits at the head of this table. We have traveled a long way. We have spoken to the rustle of the winds, have whispered in the wood, we have sung in the waters, and now we wish to tell you a story which you know without knowing it, in the speech of men." A second cushion fell off. "Let them take their silliness home," said the empress. "Oh, no, Let them go on, said the Emperor. You wish to see them, but I wish to hear them. Go on, boys. Sing me the story. The Empress was silent, but the princes began to sing the story of their lives. There once was an emperor, began they, and the third cushion fell down. While they reached the warlike expedition of the emperor, 3 of the cushions fell down at once. And when the tale was finished, there were no more cushions under the empress, but the moments that they lifted their caps and showed their golden hair and the golden stars, the eyes of the emperor and all his guests were bent on them, and they could hardly bear the power of so many glances. And there happened in the end what should have happened in the beginning. La Ptitsa sat next to her husband at the top of the table. The stepmother's daughter was tied to a wild horse. And everyone knew, and has ever forgotten, that whoever has a mind turned to wickedness is sure to end badly. Yay. Thank you for gifting the sub, puppy. What is a slurpuff? Never. There's so many freaking Pokemon I don't even know anymore. I'm doing good to know half of the Gen 1s, honestly. Even then, I wouldn't be able to name them without seeing them first. Ouch. Okay. So, our second story. Fairer Than a Fairy, from the Yellow Fairy book. Once there lived a king who had no children for many years after his marriage. At length, heaven granted him a daughter of such remarkable beauty that he could think of no name so appropriate for her as Fairer Than a Fairy. It never occurred to him, such a good-natured monarch, that such a name was certain to call down the hatred and jealousy of the fairies in the body on his child. But that's what happened. No sooner had they heard of this presumptuous name than they resolved to gain possession of her who bore it, and either to torment her cruelly, or at least conceal her from the eyes of all men. The eldest of their tribe was entrusted to carry out their revenge. This fairy was named Lagree. She was so old that she only had one eye and one tooth left, and even these poor remains she had to keep all night in a strengthening liquid. She was also so spiteful that she gladly devoted all her time to carrying out all the mean or ill-natured tricks of the whole body of the fairies. With her large expertise, added to her native spite, she found but little difficulty in carrying off Fairer Than a Fairy. The poor child, who was only 7 years old, nearly died of fear on finding herself in the power of this hideous creature. However, when after an hour's journey underground she found herself in a splendid palace with lovely gardens, she felt a little reassured and felt rather cheered when she discovered that her pet cat and dog had followed her. The old fairy led her to a pretty room, which she said should be hers, at the same time giving her the strictest orders never to let out the fire, which was burning brightly in the grate. She then gave 2 glass bottles into the princess's charge, desiring her to take the greatest care of them, and having enforced her orders with the most awful threats in case of disobedience, she vanished, leaving the little girl at liberty to explore the palace and the grounds, and a good deal relieved at only 2 apparent easy tasks. Several years passed, during which one day, whilst passing near a fountain in the garden, she noticed that the sun's rays fell on the water in such a manner as to produce a brilliant rainbow. She stood still to admire it, when, to her great surprise, she heard a voice addressing her which seemed to come from the center of its rays. The voice was that of a young man, and its sweetness of tone and the agreeable things it uttered led one to infer that its owner must be equally charming. But this had to be a mere matter of fancy, for no one was visible. The beautiful rainbow informed Fairer than a Fairy that he was young, the son of a powerful king, and that the fairy, Legree, who owned his parents, had a grudge, and had revenged herself by depriving him of his natural shape for some years. She had then imprisoned him in the palace, where he had found his confinement hard to bear for some time. But now he no longer sighed for freedom, since he had been seen and learned to love Fairer than a Fairy. He added many other tender speeches to this declaration, and the princess, to whom such remarks were a new experience, could not help feeling pleased and touched by his attentions. The prince could only appear or speak under the form of a rainbow, and it was therefore necessary that the sun should shine on the water so as to enable the rays to form themselves. Fairer than a Fairy lost no moment in which she could meet her lover, and they enjoyed many long and interesting interviews. One day, however, their conversation became so absorbing, and time passed so quickly, that the princess forgot to attend the fire, and it went out. Legree, on her return, soon found out the neglect, and seemed only too pleased to have the opportunity of showing her spite to the lovely princess. She ordered Fairer than a Fairy to start next day at dawn, and ask Lucrinus for fire, with which to relight the one she had allowed to go out. Now, this Lucrinus was a cruel monster who devoured everyone he came across, and especially enjoyed the chance of catching and eating any young girls. They're tasty. Our heroine obeyed with great sweetness, and without having been able to leave her lover, she set off to go to Lucrinus as to certain death. As she was crossing the wood, a bird sang to her to pick up a shining pebble, which she could find in the fountain close by, and to use it when needed. She took the bird's advice, and in due time arrived at the house of Lucrinus. Luckily, she only found his wife at home, who was much struck by the princess's youth and beauty and her sweet, gentle manners, and still further impressed by the presence of the shining pebble. She readily let Fairer than Fair have fire, and in return she gave her the stone. She gave her another, which she said might prove useful some day. Then she sent her away without doing her any harm. Legree was much surprised as displeased at the happy result of the expedition, and Fairer than a Fairy waited anxiously for an opportunity of meeting Prince Rainbow and telling him of her adventures. She found, however, that he had already been told all about them by a fairy who protected him, and to whom he was related. The dread of fresh dangers to his beloved princess made him devise some more convenient way of meeting than the garden fountain, and Fairer than a Fairy carried out his plan daily with entire success. Every morning she placed a large basin full of water on her window sill, and as soon as the sun's rays fell on the water, the rainbow appeared as clearly as it had done by the fountain. By this means they were able to meet without losing sight of the fire or the two bottles in which the old fairy kept her eyes and her tooth at night. And for some time the lovers enjoyed every hour of sunshine together. One day, the Prince Rainbow appeared in the depths of woe. He had just heard that he was to be banished from this lovely spot, but he had no idea where he was to go. The poor young couple were in despair, and only parted with the last rays of sunshine, and in hopes of meeting next morning. Alas, the sun broke through the clouds for a few moments, but it was still dark and gloomy. Fairer than a Fairy eagerly ran to the window, but in her haste she upset the basin, and spilt all the water which she had carefully filled it overnight. No other water was at hand except that in the two bottles. It was the only chance of seeing her lover before they were separated, so she did not hesitate to break the bottle and pour the contents into the basin. When the rainbow appeared at once, their farewells were full of tenderness. The prince made the most ardent and sincere protestations, and promised to neglect nothing which might help to deliver his dear Fairer than a Fairy from her captivity, and implored her to consent to their marriage as soon as they should both be free. The princess, on the other side, vowed to have no other husband, and declared herself willing to brave death itself in order to rejoin him. They were not allowed much time for their adieus. The rainbow vanished, and the princess, resolved to run all risks, started off at once, taking nothing with her but her dog and cat, a sprig of myrtle, and the stone which the wife of Locrinos had given her. Then Legree became aware of her prisoner's flight, and she was furious, and set off at full speed in pursuit. She overtook her just as the poor girl, overcome by fatigue, had lain down to rest in a cave, which the stone had formed itself into a shelter for her. The little dog who was watching her mistress promptly flew at Legree and bit her so severely that she stumbled against the corner of the cave and broke off her only tooth. Before she had recovered from the pain and rage this caused her, the princess had time to escape and was some way on her road. Fear gave her strength for some time, but at last she could go no further and sank down to rest. As she did so, the sprig of myrtle she carried touched the ground, and immediately a green and shady bower sprang up round her, in which she hoped to sleep in peace. But Legree had not given up her pursuit, and arrived just as Fairer than Fairy had fallen fast asleep. This time she made sure of catching her victim, but the cat spied her out, and springing from the bough of the arbor, she flew at Legree's face and tore out her only eye, thus delivering the princess forever from her prosecutor. One might have thought this would all be well now, but no sooner had Legree been put to the fight than our heroine was overwhelmed with hunger and thirst. She felt as though she would certainly expire, and it was with some difficulty that she dragged herself as far as a pretty little green and white house, which stood at no great distance. Here she was received by a beautiful lady dressed in green and white to match the house, which apparently belonged to her, and which she seemed the only inhabitant. Greeting the fainting princess most kindly, she gave her an excellent supper, and after a long night's rest in a delightful bed, told her that after many troubles she should finally attain her desire. As the green and white lady took leave of the princess, she gave her a nut, desiring her only to open it in the most urgent need. After a long and tiring journey, Fairer than a Fairy was once more received in a house by a lady exactly like the one she had quitted. Here again she received a present with the same injunctions, but instead of a nut, the lady gave her a golden pomegranate. The mournful princess had to continue her weary way, and after many troubles and hardships, she again found rest and shelter in a third house, exactly similar to the other two. These houses belonged to the three sisters, all endowed with fairy gifts, and all so alike in mind and person that they wished their houses and garments to be equally alike. Their occupation consisted in helping those in misfortune, and they were as gentle and benevolent as Legree had been cruel and spiteful. The third fairy comforted the poor traveler, begged her not to lose heart, and assured her that her troubles should be rewarded. She accompanied her advice with a gift of a crystal smelling bottle, with strict orders only to open it in case of urgent need. Fairer than a Fairy thanked her warmly and resumed her way, cheered by pleasant thoughts. After a time her road led through a wood full of soft airs and sweet odors, and before she had gone 100 yards she saw a wonderful silver castle suspended by strong silver chains to four of the largest trees. It was so perfectly hung that a gentle breeze rocked it sufficiently to send you pleasantly to sleep. Fairer than a Fairy felt a strong desire to enter the castle, but besides being hung a little above ground, there seemed to be neither doors nor windows, and she had no doubt, though really I cannot think why, that eh, that the moment had come in which to use the nut which he had given to her. She opened it, and out came a diminutive hall porter, at whose bell rung a tiny chain, and at the end was a golden half key as long as the smallest pin you ever saw. The princess climbed up one of the silver chains, holding in her hand the little porter, who, in spite of his minute size, opened a secret door with his golden key and let her in. She entered a magnificent room which appeared to occupy the entire castle, and which was lighted by gold and jeweled stars in the ceiling. In the midst of this room stood a couch, draped with curtains of all the colors of the rainbow, and suspended by golden cords so that it swayed with the castle, and the manner which it rocked the occupants delightfully to sleep. On this elegant couch lay Prince Rainbow, looking more beautiful than ever, and sunk in the profound slumber in which he had been ever since his disappearance. Fairer than a Fairy, who now saw him for the first time in his real shape, hardly dared to gaze at him, fearing lest his appearance might not be in keeping with the voice and language which had won her heart. At the same time, she could not help feeling rather hurt at the apparent indifference with which she was received. She related all the dangers and difficulties she had gone through, and though she repeated the story 20 times in a loud, clear voice, the prince slept on and took no heed. Then she had recourse to the golden pomegranate, and opening it, found it that all the seeds were as many little violins, which flew up in the vaulted roof, and at once began playing melodiously. The prince was not completely aroused, but he opened his eyes a little and looked all the handsomer. Impatient at not being recognized, Fairer than a Fairy now drew out the third present, and on opening the crystal scent bottle, a little siren flew out, who silenced the violins and then sang close to the prince's ear the story of all his lady love had endured in her search for him. She added some little reproaches to the tale, but before she had got far as he was wide awake, and, transported with joy, threw himself at the princess's feet. At the same moment, the walls of the room expanded and opened out, revealing a gold throne covered in jewels. A magnificent court now began to assemble, and at the same time elegant carriages filled with ladies and magnificent coaches drove up. At the first, the most splendid of these carriages sat Prince Rainbow's mother. She fondly embraced her son, after which she informed him that his father had been dead for some years, that the anger of the fairies was at length appeased, and that he might return in peace to reign over his people, who were longing for his presence. The court received the new king with joyful acclamations, which would have delighted him at any other time. But all his thoughts were full of Fairer than a Fairy. He was just about to present her to his mother and the court, feeling that she could charm and win all their hearts, when the three green and white sisters appeared. They declared the secret of Fairer than a Fairy's royal birth, and the queen, taking the two lovers in her carriage, set off with them to the capital of the kingdom. Here they were received with tumultuous joy. The wedding was celebrated without delay, and succeeding years diminished neither the virtues or beauty, nor the mutual affection of King Rainbow and his queen, Fairer than a Fairy. Excuse me. Oh, that's two stories down. Okay, oh, another stretch. Oh, ah. I get the feeling this one might be a little bit longer story. Not that bad. The next story, the story of Bensurdatu. from the Yellow Fairy Book. There was once a king and queen who had 3 wonderfully beautiful daughters, and their one thought from morning till night was how they could make the girls happy. One day the princesses said to the king, "Dear father, we want so much to have a picnic and to eat our dinner in the country." "Very well, dear children. Let us have a picnic by all means," answered he, and gave orders that everything should get ready. When luncheon was prepared, it was put into a cart, and the royal family stepped into the carriage and drove right away to the country. A few miles they reached a house and garden belonging to the king, and close by was their favorite place to lunch. The drive was made and had them very hungry, and they ate with a hearty appetite, till almost all the food had disappeared. When they had quite done, they said to their parents, "Now we should like to wander about in the garden a little, but when you want to go home, just call to us." And they ran off, laughing, down a green glade which led to the garden. But no sooner had they stepped across the fence than a dark cloud came down and covered them, and prevented them from seeing whither they were going. Meanwhile the king and queen sat lazily among the heather, and an hour or two slipped by. The sun was dropping towards the horizon, and they began to think that it was time to go home. So they called their daughters and called again, but no one answered them. Frightened at the silence, they searched every corner of the garden, and the house, and the neighboring wood, but no trace of the girls was to be found anywhere. The earth seemed to have swallowed them up. The poor parents were in despair. The queen wept all the way home, and for many days after, and the king issued a proclamation that whoever should bring back his lost daughters should have one of them to wife, and should, after his death, reign in his stead. Now, 2 young generals were at the time living at the court, and when they heard the king's declaration, they said one to the other, "Let us go and search for them. Perhaps we shall be the lucky persons." And they set out, each mounted on a strong horse, taking with them a change of raiment and some money. But though they inquired at every village they rode through, they could hear nothing of the princesses, and by their money was all spent, and they were forced to sell their horses or give up the search. Even this money only lasted a little while longer, and nothing but their clothes lay between them and starvation. They sold their spare garments that were bound on their saddles, and went on in the coats they stood up to in the rain at the inn to beg for some food, as they were really starving. When, however, they had to pay for what they had eaten and drank, they said to the host, "We have no money, and naught but the clothes we stand up in. Take these, and give us instead some old rags, and let us stay here and serve you." And the innkeeper was content with this bargain, and the generals remained and were his servants. All this time the king and queen remained in their palace, hungering for their children, but not a word was heard of either of them, or of the generals who had gone to seek them. Now, there was living in the palace a faithful servant of the king's calling, Bensurdatu, who had served him for many years. And when Bensurdatu saw how grieved the king was, he lifted up his voice and said to him, "Your Majesty, let me go. I will seek your daughters." "Oh, no, Bensurdatu," replied the king. "3 daughters I have lost, and 2 generals, and shall I lose you also?" But Bensurdatu said again, "Let me go now, your majesty. Trust me, I will bring back your daughters." Then the king gave way, and Bensurdatu set forth, and rode on till he came to the inn, where he dismounted and asked for food. It was brought by the two generals, whom he knew at once in spite of their miserable clothes, and was much astonished, asking them how in the world they came there. They told him all their adventures, and he sent for the innkeeper and said to him, "Give them back their garments, and I will pay everything that they owe you." The innkeeper did as he was bid, and when the two generals were dressed in their proper clothes, they declared they would join Bensurdatu, and with him seek the king's daughters. The three companions rode on for many miles, and at length they came to a wild place, without sign of human beings. It was getting dark, and fearing to be lost in this desolate spot, they pushed on their horses, and at last saw the light in a window of a tiny hut. "Who comes there?" asked a voice as they knocked on the door. "Oh, have pity on us, and give us a night's shelter," replied Bensurdatu. "We are three tired travelers who have lost our way." Then the door was opened by a very old woman, who stood back and beckoned them to enter. "Whence do you come from, and whither do you go?" she said. "Ah, good woman, we have a heavy task before us," answered Bensurdatu. "We are bound to carry the king's daughters back to the palace." "Oh, unhappy creatures!" she cried. "You know not what you are doing. The king's daughters were covered by a thick cloud, and no one knows where they may be now." "Oh, tell us if you know, my good woman," entreated Bensurdatu, "for with them lies all our happiness." "Even if I were to tell you," answered she, "you could not rescue them. To do that you would have to go to the very bottom of a deep river, and though certainly you would find the king's daughters there, yet the two eldest are guarded by two giants, and the youngest is watched by a serpent with 7 heads." The two generals who stood by listening were filled with terror at these words, and wished to return immediately. But Bensurdatu stood firm and said, "Now we've got so far, we must carry the thing through. Tell us where the river is, so that we may get there as soon as possible." And the old woman told them, and gave them some cheese, wine, and bread, so that they should not set forth starving. And when they had eaten and drunk, they laid themselves down to sleep. The sun had only just risen above the hills next morning before they all woke, and taking leave of the wise woman who had helped them, they rode on till they came to the river. "I'm the oldest," said one of the guards, "and it is my right to go down first." So the others fastened a cord around him, and gave him a little bell, and let him down into the water. But scarcely had the river closed above his head when such a dreadful rushing sounds and peals of thunder came crashing about him that he lost all his courage and rang his bell, if perchance it might be heard amongst all the clamour. Great was his relief when the rope began to slowly pull him upwards. Then the other general plunged in, but he fared no better than the first, and was soon on dry ground again. "Well, you are a brave pair," said Bensurdatu, and he tied the rope round his waist. "Let us see what will happen to me." And when he heard the thunder and clamour around about him, he thought to himself, "Oh, make such a noise as you like, it won't hurt me." When his feet touched the bottom, he found himself in a large, brilliantly lighted hall, and in the middle sat the oldest princess, and in front of her lay a huge giant. fast asleep. Directly he saw Bensurdatu, she nodded to him and asked with her eyes how she had come there. For his answer, he drew his sword, and was about to cut off the giant's head when she stopped him quickly and made signs to hide himself, as the giant was just beginning to wake. I smell the blood of a man, murmured he, stretching out his arms. Why, how in the world could any man get down here? She replied. You had better go to sleep again. He turned over and went to sleep. Then the princess signed to Bensurdatu, who drew his sword and cut off the giant's head with such a blow that it flew into the corner. And the heart of the princess leapt within her, and she placed a golden crown on the head of Bensurdatu, and called him her deliverer. Now, tell me where your sisters are, said he, that I might free them also. So the princess opened a door and led him into another hall, wherein sat the next sister, guarded by a giant who was also fast asleep. When the second princess saw them, she made a sign to them to hide themselves, for the giant was showing symptoms of waking. I smell man's flesh, he murmured sleepily. Now, how could any man get down here? Asked she. Go to sleep again. And as soon as he closed his eyes, Bensurdatu stole out from his corner and struck such a blow at his head that it flew far, far away. The princess could not find words to thank Bensurdatu for what he had done, and she too placed on his hand a golden crown. Now, show me where the youngest sister is, he said, that I may free her also. Ah, that I fear you will never be able to do, they sighed, for she is in the power of a serpent with 7 heads. Take me to him, replied Bensurdatu. It will be a splendid fight. Then the princess opened a door, and Bensurdatu passed through, and found himself in a hall that was even larger than the other two. And there stood the youngest sister, chained fast to the wall. Before her was a serpent stretched out with 7 heads, horrible to see. As Bensurdatu came forward, it twisted all its 7 heads in his direction, and then made a quick dart to snatch him up within his grasp. But Bensurdatu drew his sword and laid about him, till 7 heads were rolling on the floor. Flinging down his sword, he rushed to the princess and broke her chains. And she wept with joy and embraced him, and took the golden crown from off her head and placed it in his hand. Now, we must get back to the upper world, said Bensurdatu, and led her to the bottom of the river. The other princesses were waiting there, and he tied the rope around the eldest and rung his bell, and the 2 generals above heard and drew her gently up. Then they fastened the cord and threw it back into the river. In a few moments, the second princess stood beside her sister. So now there were only Bensurdatu and the youngest princess. Dear Bensurdatu, she said, do me a kindness and let them draw you up before me. I dread treachery in the generals. No, no, replied Bensurdatu. I certainly will not leave you down here. There is nothing to fear from my comrades. If it is your wish, I will go up then. But I swear that if you do not follow me to marry me, I shall stay single for the rest of my life. Then he bound the rope about her, and the generals drew her up. But instead of lowering the rope again into the river, the envy at the courage and success of Bensurdatu so filled their hearts that they turned away and left him to perish. Go figure. And more than that, they threatened the princesses and forced them to promise to tell their parents that it was the two generals who had set them free. And should they ever ask you about Bensurdatu, you must say that you have never seen him, they added. And the princesses, fearing for their lives, promised everything, and they rode back to the courts together. The king and queen were beside themselves with joy when they saw their dear children once more. But when the generals had told their story and the dangers they had run, the king declared that they had gained their reward, and that the two eldest princesses should become their wives. And now we must see what poor Bensurdatu was doing. He waited patiently a long, long time. When the rope never came back, he knew that he had been wrong, and that his comrades had betrayed him. Now I shall never reach the world again, murmured he. But, being a brave man, and knowing that moaning his fate would profit him nothing, he rose and began to search through the three halls, where perhaps he might find something to help him. And the last one stood a dish, covered with food, which reminded him that he was hungry. So he sat down and ate and drank. Months passed, when one morning he was walking through the halls. He noticed a purse hanging on the wall, which he had never seen there before. He took it down to examine it, and nearly let it fall with his surprise when the voice came out of the purse, saying, "What commands have you?" "Oh, take me out of this horrible place, and up into the world again." And in a moment he was standing by the river bank, with the purse tightly grasped in his hands. "Now, let me have the most beautiful ship that was ever built, all manned and ready for sea." And there was a ship, with a flag floating from its masts, on which there were words, "King of the Three Crowns." Then Bensurdatu climbed on board, and sailed away to the city where the three princesses dwelt. And when he reached the harbor, he blew trumpets and beat drums, so that everyone ran to the doors and windows. And the king heard too, and saw the beautiful vessel, and said to himself, "That must indeed be a mighty monarch, for he has 3 crowns, while I only have 1. Crowned me." So he hastened to greet the stranger, and invited him to the castle, for he thought, "This will be a fine husband for my youngest daughter." Now, the youngest princess had never married, and had turned a deaf ear to all her wooers. Such a long time had passed since Bensurdatu had left the palace, that the king never guessed for a moment that the splendidly clad stranger before him was a man whom he had so deeply mourned as dead. "Noble lord," said he, "let us feast and make merry together, and then, if it seem good to you, do me the honor to take my youngest daughter to wife." Sir, and Bensurdatu was glad, and they all sat down to a great feast, and they were great rejoicings. But only the youngest daughter was sad, for her thoughts were with Bensurdatu. After they rose from the table, the king said to her, "Dear child, this mighty lord does you the honor to ask for your hand in marriage." "Oh, father," answered she, "spare me, I pray you, for I desire to remain single." Then Bensurdatu turned to her and said, "And if I were Bensurdatu, would you give me the same answer to me?" As she stood silently gazing at him, he added, "Yes, I am Bensurdatu, and this is my story." The king and queen had their hearts stirred within them at the tale of his adventures. And when he had ended, the king stretched out his hand and said, Dear Bensurdatu, my youngest daughter shall indeed be your wife, and when I die, my crown shall be yours. As for the men who have betrayed you, they shall leave the country, and you shall see them no more. And the wedding feast was ordered, and rejoicings were held for 3 days over the marriage of Bensurdatu and the youngest princess. Of course, this means that the king banishes 2 older daughters with their generals because they were married, right? It doesn't say. But he had married his 2 older daughters to the generals. As the generals were banished, he's the king. He can annul it. It's good to be the king. Okay. If anyone in chat can recognize that, I will give you points if I can figure it out. I honestly don't know the command to give points. I know I can, I just don't remember what the command is. I guess I could look it up, but that would be work, and I don't want to do that yet. Anyway. No, I'm not a crackpot. No, I'm not at all drinking. Let's see. The next story is... Oh, 5 pages? I think I can do the math. Yeah, 5 pages long. And after that... Oh, there's going to be a singing story. Oh well, I can do a singing story. Not right now, but it'll be the next one after this one. Anyhow, another stretch. Oh, because parking my tail and reading is kind of stressful. Anyway, next story. Maiden Bright-Eye from the Pink Fairy book. Once upon a time, there was a man and his wife who had 2 children, a boy and a girl. The wife was dead, and the man married again. The new wife had only a daughter, who was both ugly and untidy, whereas the stepdaughter was a beautiful girl, and was known as Maiden Bright-Eye. Her stepmother was very cruel to her on this account. She had always to do the hardest work, and got very little to eat, and no attention paid to her. But to her own daughter she was oh so good. She was spared from all the hardest of the housework, and always had the prettiest clothes to wear. She needed them. Maiden Bright-Eye had also to watch the sheep, but of course it would never do to let her go idle and enjoy herself too much at this work, so she had to pull heather while she was out in the moors with them. Her stepmother gave her pancakes to take with her for her dinner, but she had mixed the flour with ashes and made them just as bad as she could. The little girl came out on the moor and began to pull heather on the side of the little mound. But next minute a little fellow with a red cap on his head popped up from the mound and said, "Who's pulling the roof off my house?" "Oh, it's me, just a poor little girl," she said. "My mother sent me out here and told me to pull heather. If you'll be good to me, I will only give you a little of my dinner." Well, the little fellow was quite willing, and she gave him the biggest share of her pancakes. They were not particularly good, but when one is hungry, anything tastes well. And after he had gotten them all eaten, he said to her, "Now I shall give you 3 wishes, for you are a very nice little girl. But I will choose the wishes for you." "You are beautiful, and much more beautiful than you shall be. Yes, and so lovely that there will be not your like in the world. The next wish shall be that every time you open your mouth, a gold coin shall fall out of it, and your voice shall be like the most beautiful music. The third wish shall be that you will be married to a young king, and become the queen of a country. At the same time I shall give you a cap, which you must carefully keep, for it can save you, if you ever are in danger of your life, if you just pull it on your head." Maiden Bright-Eye thanked the little bergman ever so often, and drove home her sheep in the evening. By that time she had grown so beautiful that her people could scarcely recognize her. Her stepmother asked her how it had come that she had grown so beautiful. She told her the whole story, for she always told the truth, that a little man had come out of the moor and had given her all this beauty. She did not tell, however, that she had given him a share of her dinner. The stepmother thought to herself, "If one can become so beautiful by going out there, my own daughter shall also be sent, for she can well stand being made a little prettier." Next morning she baked for her the finest cakes, dressed her prettily to go out with the sheep, but she was afraid to go away without their having a stick to defend herself if anything should come near her. She was not very much inclined for pulling the heather, and she never was in the habit of doing any work. But she was only a minute or so at it when up came the same little fellow with the red cap and said, "Who's that pulling on the roof of my house?" "What's it to you?" she said. "Well, if you give me a bit of your dinner, I won't do any mischief," he said. "I will give you something else in place of my dinner," said she. "I can easily eat it myself, but if you will have something, you can have a whack of my stick." And with that she raised it in the air and struck the bergman over the head with it. "Now, what a wicked little girl you are," said he. "But you shall be none better than this. I shall give you 3 wishes, and choose them for you. First, I shall say, ugly you are, and you will become so ugly that there will not be an uglier one on earth. Next, I shall wish that every time you open your mouth, a big toad may fall out of it, and your voice will sound like the roaring of a bull. In the third place, I shall wish for you a violent death." Yikes. The girl went home in the evening, and when her mother saw that she was as vexed as she could be, and with good reason too, but it was still worse when she saw the toads fall out of her mouth and heard her voice. Now, we really should hear something about the stepson. He had gone out into the world to look about him, and took service in the king's palace. About this time he got permission to go home and see his sister, and when he saw how lovely and beautiful she was, he was so pleased and delighted that when he came back to the king's palace everyone wanted to know what he was always so happy about. He told them that it was because he had such a beautiful sister at home. At last it came to the ears of the king what the brother had said about his sister, and besides that, the report of her beauty spread far and wide. so that the youth was summoned before the king, who asked him if everything was true about what was told about the girl. He said it was quite true, for he had seen her beauty with his own eyes, and had heard with his own ears how sweetly she could sing, and what a lovely voice she had. The king then took a great desire for her, and ordered her brother to go home and bring her back with him, for he trusted no one better to accomplish this errand. He got a ship and everything else that he required, and sailed home for his sister. As soon as the stepsister heard what his errand was, she at once said to herself, "This will never come about if I can do anything to hinder it, but she must be allowed to come to such honor." And then she got a dress made for her own daughter, like the finest robe for a queen, and she had a mask prepared and put it upon her face, so that she looked quite pretty, and gave her strict orders to not take the thing off until the king had promised to wed her. The brother now set sail with his two sisters, for the stepmother pretended that the ugly one wanted to see the other a bit on her way. But when they were at sea, and Maiden Bright-Eye came up on deck, the sister did as her mother bade her. She gave her a push and made her fall into the water. When the brother learned what had happened, he was greatly distressed, and he did not know what to do. Pull her in the water. He could not bring himself to tell the truth about what had happened, nor did he expect the king would believe it. In the long run, he decided to hold on this way and let things go as they liked. Idiot. What he had expected happened. The king received his sister and wedded her at once, but repented it the first night. He could scarcely put down his foot in the morning for all the toads that were in his room. And when he saw her real face, he was so enraged at the brother, they had him thrown into a pit full of serpents. He was so angry, not merely because he had been deceived, but because he could not get rid of the ugly wretch that was now tied to him for life. But now, let's see what happened to Maiden Bright. When she fell into the water, she was fortunate enough to get the Bergman's cap put on her head. For now she was in danger for her life, and she was at once transformed into a duck. The duck swam away from the ship and came to the king's palace on the next evening. There it waddled up the drain, and so into the kitchen, where her little dog lay on the hearthstone. It could not bear to stay in the fine chambers along with the ugly sister, understandably, and had taken refuge down there. The duck hopped up till it could talk to the dog. "Good morning," it said. "Thanks, Maiden Bright-Eye," said the dog. "Where's my brother?" "He's in the serpent pit." "Where's my wicked sister?" "She's with the noble king." "Alas, alas! I'm here this evening, and shall be for 2 evenings yet, and then I shall never come again." When it had said this, the duck waddled off again. Several of the servant girls heard the conversation and were greatly surprised at it, and thought that it would be worth while to catch the bird next evening and see into the matter a little more closely. They had heard it say that it would come again. Next evening it appeared as it had said, and a great many were present to see it. It came waddling in by the drain, and went up to the dog, which was lying on the hearthstone. "Good evening." "Thanks, Bright Maiden Bright-Eye, said the dog.
Where's my brother?
He's in the serpent pit.
Where's my wicked sister?
She's with the noble king.
Alas, alas! I am here this evening, and shall be for one evening yet, and then I shall never come again.
After this, it slipped out, and no one could get a hold of it. But the king's cook thought to himself, I shall see if I can get a hold of you tomorrow evening. On the third evening, the duck came waddling in by the drain, and up to the dog on the hearthstone.
Good evening, it said.
Thanks, Maiden Bright-Eye, said the dog.
Where's my brother?
He is in the serpent pit.
Where's my wicked sister?
She is with the noble king.
Alas, alas! Now I shall never come again.
With this, it slipped out again. But in the meantime, the cook had posted himself at the outer end of the drain with a net, which he threw over it as it came out. In this way he caught it, and came in to the others with the most beautiful duck they had ever seen, with so many golden feathers on it that everyone marveled. No one, however, knew what was to be done with it, but after what they had heard, they knew that there was something uncommon about the duck, and they took good care of it. At this time, the brother in the serpent pit dreamed that his right sister had come swimming to the king's palace in the shape of a duck, and that she would not regain her own form again until her beak was cut off. He got this dream and told someone, so that the king at last came to hear it, and had him taken out of the pit and brought before him. The king then asked him if he could produce his sister, a beautiful one, which he had formerly described her. The brother said that he could if they would bring him the duck and a knife. Both of them were brought to him, and he said, I wonder how you would look if I were to cut the point of your beak. With this, he cut a piece of the beak. And there came a voice which said, Oh, no, you cut my little finger. The next moment, Maiden Bright-Eye stood there, as lovely and beautiful as he had seen her when he was home. This was his sister now, he said, and the whole story now came out about how the other had behaved to her. The wicked sister was put into a barrel with spikes round it, and which was dragged off by 6 wild horses. So she came to her end. But the king was delighted with Maiden Bright-Eye, and immediately made her his queen, while her brother became his prime minister. Put in a barrel of spikes and dragged by 6 wild horses. That does not sound pleasurable at all. Maybe if it didn't have the spikes, it could be fun, but it was spikes and pickle and juice in another. Yeah, anyway. Let us carry on. Our next wonderful story for the night is the story of Pretty Goldilocks from the Blue Fairy Book. Once upon a time, there was a princess who was the prettiest creature in the world. And because she was so beautiful, and because her hair was like the finest gold, and rippled and waved nearly to the ground, she was called this pretty Goldilocks. She always wore a crown of flowers, and her dresses were embroidered with diamonds and pearls, and everybody who saw her fell in love with her. Of course. Now, one of her neighbors was a young king who was not married. He was very rich and handsome, and when he heard all that was said about pretty Goldilocks, though he had never seen her, he fell so deeply in love with her that he could neither eat nor drink. So he resolved to send an ambassador to ask for her in marriage. He had a splendid carriage made for his ambassador, and gave him more than 100 horses and 100 servants, and told him, to be sure, to bring the princess back with him. After he had started, nothing else was talked of at court, and the king felt so sure that the princess would consent that he sent his people to work at pretty dresses and splendid furniture, that they might be ready by the time. Whether she happened to be just cross that day, or whether the compliment did not please her, is not known. She only answered that she was very much obliged to the king, but she had no wish to be married. The ambassador set off sadly on his homeward way, bringing all the king's presents back with him, for the princess was too well brought up to accept the pearls and diamonds when she would not accept the king. So she had only kept 25 English pence that he might not be vexed. When the ambassador reached the city, where the king was waiting impatiently, everybody was very much annoyed with him for not bringing back the princess, and the king cried like a baby, and nobody could console him. Now, there was in court a young man who was more clever and handsome than anyone else, and he was called Charming. And everyone loved him, except a few envious people who were angry at his being the king's favorite and knowing all the state secrets. Because, of course, he happened to one day be with some people who were speaking of the ambassador's return and saying that his going to the princess would have done much good. When Charming said rashly, "If the king had sent me to Princess Goldilocks, I am sure she would have come back with me." His enemies at once went to the king and said, "You hardly believe this, sire, but Charming has the audacity to say that if he had been sent to the Princess Goldilocks, she would have certainly come back with him. He seems to think that he is so much handsomer than yourself, and the princess would have fallen in love with him and followed him willingly." The king was furious at hearing this. "Ha ha," he said. "Does he laugh at my unhappiness and think himself more fascinating than I am? Go, and let him be shut up in my great tower to die of hunger." So the king's guards went to fetch Charming, who had thought no more of his rash speech, and carried him off to prison with great cruelty. The poor prisoner had only a little straw for his bed, but for a little stream of water which flowed through the tower, he would have died of thirst. One day he was in despair, so he said to himself, "How can I have offended the king? I am his most faithful subject, and have done nothing against him." So bragging. The king chanced to be passing the tower and recognized the voice of his former favorite. He stopped to listen in spite of Charming's enemies, who tried to persuade him to have nothing more to do with the traitor. But the king said, "Oh, be quiet. I wish to hear what he says." And then he opened the tower door and called to Charming, who came very sadly and kissed the king's hand, saying, "What have I done, sire, to deserve this cruel treatment?" "You mocked me to my ambassador," and the king, "and you have said that if I sent you to Princess Goldilocks, you would certainly have brought her back." "It's quite true, sire," replied Charming. "I should have drawn such a picture of you, and represented your good qualities in such a way, that I'm certain the princess would have found you irresistible. But I cannot see why there is any way that could have made you angry." The king could not see any cause for anger, either when the matter was presented to him in this light, and he began to frown very fiercely at the courtiers who had misrepresented his favourite. So he took Charming back to the palace with him, and after seeing that he had a very good supper, said to him, "You know that I love Princess Goldilocks as much as ever. Her refusal was not made any difference to me, but I don't know how to make her change her mind. I really should like to send you to see if you can persuade her to marry me." Charming replied that he was perfectly willing to go, and would set out the very next day. "But you must wait till I can get a grand escort for you," said the king. But Charming said that he only wanted a good horse to ride, and the king, who was delighted at his being ready to go so promptly, gave him letters to the princess, and bade him good speed. It was on a Monday morning that he set out all alone on his errand, thinking of nothing but how he could persuade the Princess Goldilocks to marry the king. He had a writing book in his pocket, and whenever a happy thought struck him, he dismounted from his horse and sat down under the trees to put in a good harangue he was preparing for the princess, before he forgot it. One day, when he had started at the very earliest dawn, he was riding over a great meadow, and he had a capital idea. And springing from his horse, he sat down under a willow which grew by a little river. When he had written it down, he was looking around him, pleased to find himself in such a pretty place. When all was once he saw a great golden carp lying gasping, exhausted on the grass, and leaping over little flies, she had thrown herself high upon the bank, where she had lain until she was nearly dead. Charming took pity on her, and though he couldn't help thinking that it would be very nice for a little dinner, he picked her up gently and put her back in the water. As soon as Dame Carp felt the refreshing coolness of the river, she sank down joyfully to the bottom of the river. Then, swimming back up to the top, quite boldly, she said, "Thank you, Charming, for the kindness you have done me. You have saved my life. One day I will repay you." So saying, she sank down into the water again, leaving Charming greatly astounded at her politeness, able to speak. Another day, as he journeyed on, he saw a raven in great distress. The poor bird was closely pursued by an eagle, which would soon have eaten it had Charming not quickly fitted an arrow, shot the eagle dead. The raven perched upon a tree very joyfully.
"Charming,"
said he,
"it was very generous for you to rescue a poor raven. I am not ungrateful. Some day I will repay you."
Charming thought it was very nice of the raven to say so, and went on his way. Before the sun had rose, he found himself in a thick wood, where it was too dark for him to see his path. And here he heard an owl crying, as if it were in despair. "Hark!" said he. "That must be a great owl in trouble. I'm sure it has gone into a snare." And he began to hunt about, and presently found the great net which some bird catchers had spread the night before. "What a pity it is that men do nothing but torment and persecute poor creatures which never do them any harm," he said. And he took out his wife and cut the cords of the net. And the owl flitted away into the darkness. And then turning, with one flicker of her wings, she came back to Charming and said,
It does not need many words to tell you how great a service you have done me. I was caught. In a few minutes the fowlers would have been here. Without your help I should have been killed. I'm grateful, and one day I will repay you."
These 3 adventures were the only ones of any consequence that befell Charming on his journey, and he made all haste he could to reach the palace of Princess Goldilocks. When he arrived, he thought everything he saw was delightful and magnificent. Diamonds were as pebbles, and the gold and silver, the dresses, the sweetmeats, and pretty things that were everywhere quite amazed him. He thought to himself, "If the princess consents to leave all this and come with me to marry the king, he may think himself lucky." Then he dressed himself carefully in rich brocade, with scarlet and white plumes, and threw a splendid embroidered scarf over his shoulder, and, looking as gay and as graceful as possible, he presented himself at the door of the palace, carrying in his arm a tiny pretty dog which he had bought on the way. The guard saluted him respectfully, and a messenger was sent to the princess to announce the arrival of Charming as ambassador of her neighbor the king.
"Charming," said the princess. "The name promises well. I have no doubt that he is good-looking and fascinates everybody."
"Indeed he does, ma'am," said all of her maids in honor of one breath.
"We saw him from the window in the garret where we were splitting flax, and we could do nothing but look for him as long as he was in sight." "Well, to be sure," said the princess. "That's how you amuse yourselves, is it? Looking at strangers out the window? Be quick and give me my blue satin embroidered dress, and comb out my golden hair. Let somebody make my fresh garlands of flowers, and give me high-heeled shoes and my fan, and tell them to sweep my great hall and my throne, for I want everyone to say that I am really pretty Goldilocks."
Ego. You can imagine how our maids scurried this way and that to make the princess ready, and in their haste they knocked their heads a few times and hindered each other, till she thought they would never have gotten everything done. However, at last they led her into the gallery of mirrors, that she might assure herself that nothing was lacking in her appearance, and then she mounted her throne of gold, ebony, and ivory, while her ladies took their guitars and began to sing softly. Then Charming was led in, and was so struck with astonishment and admiration that at first not a word could he say. But presently he took courage and delivered his harangue, bravely ending by begging the princess to spare him the disappointment of going back without her.
"Sir Charming," answered she, "all the reasons you have given me are very good ones, and I assure you that I should not have more pleasure in obliging you than anyone else. But you must know that a month ago I was walking by the river with my ladies, and I took off my glove. And as I did so, the ring that I was wearing slipped off my finger and rolled into the water. As I valued it more than my kingdom, you may imagine how vexed I was at losing it. and I vowed to never listen to any proposal of marriage unless the ambassador first brought me back my ring. So, now you know what is expected of you, for if you talked for 15 days and 15 nights, you could not make me change my mind.
Charming was very much surprised by this answer. He bowed low to the princess and begged her to accept the embroidered cloth and the tiny dog he had brought with him. But she answered she did not want any presents, and that he was to remember what she had told him. When he got back to his lodgings, he went to bed without eating any supper, and the little dog, who was called Frisk, couldn't eat any either, but came and lay down close beside him. All night, Charming sighed and lamented.
How am I to find the ring that fell into the river a month ago? Said he. It is useless to try. The princess must have told me to do it on purpose, knowing it was impossible.
Of course. Then he sighed again. Frisk heard him and said,
Dear master, don't despair. Your luck may change. You're too good not to be happy. Let us go down to the river as soon as it is light.
But Charming only gave him 2 little pats and said nothing, and very soon he fell asleep. At the first glimmer of dawn, Frisk began to jump about, and when he was awakened Charming, they went out together, first to the garden, then down by the river's bank, where they wandered up and down. Charming was thinking sadly of having to go back unsuccessful when he heard someone calling,
Charming! Charming!
Who calls me? Said he. Frisk, who was very small and could look closely into the water, cried out,
I see a golden carp!
And sure enough, there was the great carp, who said to Charming,
You have saved my life in the meadow by the willow tree, and I promised that I would repay you. Take this. It is Princess Goldilocks' ring.
Charming took the ring out of Dame Carp's mouth, thanking her 1,000 times. And he and Tiny Frisk went straight to the palace, where someone told the princess that he was asking for her.
Poor fellow, she said. He must have come to say his goodbye, finding it impossible to do as I asked.
So in came Charming, who presented her with the ring, and said, Madam, I have done your bidding. Will it please you to marry my master? When the princess saw her ring brought back to her unhurt, she was so astonished that she thought she must be dreaming.
Truly, Charming, she said, you must be the favorite of some fairy, or you would never have found it.
Madam, answered he, I was helped by nothing but my desire to obey your wishes.
Since you are so kind, she said, perhaps you will do me another service. For till it is done, I will never be married. There is a prince not far from here, whose name is Galifron, who once wanted to marry me. But when I refused, he uttered the most terrible threats against me, and vowed that he would lay waste to my country. But what could I do? I could not marry a frightful giant as tall as a tower, who eats up people as a monkey eats chestnuts, and who talks so loudly that anyone who has to listen to him becomes quite deaf. Nevertheless, he does not cease to persecute me and kill my subjects. So, before I can listen to your proposal, you must kill him and bring me his head.
No problem. Charming was rather dismayed at this command, but he answered, Very well, princess, I will fight this Galifron. I believe that he will kill me, but at any rate I shall die in your defense. Then the princess was frightened, and said everything she could to think of to prevent Charming from fighting the giant. But it was of no use, and he went out to arm himself suitably, and then, taking little Frisk with him, he mounted his horse and set out for Galifron's country. Everyone he met told him what a terrible giant Galifron was, and that nobody dared go near him, for the more he heard, the more frightened he grew. Frisk tried to encourage him by saying,
"While you're fighting the giant, dear master, I will go and bite his heels, and when he stoops down to look at you, you can kill him."
Charming praised his little dog's plan, but knew that his help would not do much good. At last he drew near the giant's castle, and saw to his horror that every path that led to it was strewn with bones. Before long he saw Galifron coming. His head was higher than the tallest trees, and he sang in a terrible voice. "Bring out your little boys and girls, pray do not stay to do their curls, for I shall eat so very many, I shall not know if they have any." Thereupon Charming sang out as loud as he could, to the same tune. "Come out and meet the valiant Charming, who finds you not at all alarming. Although he is not very tall, he is big enough to make you fall." Epigraph battles of fairy tales. The rhymes were not very correct, but you see he had made them up so quickly that it is a miracle that they were not worse, especially as he was horribly frightened at the time. When Galifron heard these words, he looked about him and saw Charming standing, sword in hand. This put the giant into a terrible rage, and he aimed a blow at Charming with his huge iron club, which would certainly have killed him if it had reached him. But at that instant a raven perched on the giant's head, and pecking with its strong beak and beating with its great wings, so confused and blinded him that his blows fell harmlessly upon the air. And Charming, rushing in, gave him several strokes with his sharp sword, so that he fell to the ground. Whereupon Charming cut off his head before he knew anything about it, and the raven, from a tree close by, croaked out,
"I see you have not forgotten the good turn you did me in killing the eagle. Today I think I have fulfilled my promise of repaying you."
"Indeed, I owe you more gratitude than you ever owed me," replied Charming. And then he mounted his horse and rode off with Galifron's head. When he reached the city, the people ran after him in crowds, crying, "Behold brave Charming, who has killed the giants!" And their shouts reached the princess's ears. But she dared not ask what was happening, for fear she should hear that Charming had been killed. But very soon he arrived at the palace with the great giant's head, of which she was still terrified, though it could no longer really do her any harm. "Princess," said Charming, "I have killed your enemy. I hope you will now consent to marry the king, my master."
"Oh dear, no,"
said the princess.
"not until you have brought me some water from the gloomy cavern." "Not far from here, there is a deep cave, the entrance to which is guarded by two dragons with fiery eyes, who will not allow anyone to pass them. When you get to the cavern, you will find an immense hole, which you must go down, and it is full of toads and snakes. At the bottom of this hole there is another little cave, in which rises a fountain of health and beauty. It is some of this water that I really must have. Everything it touches becomes wonderful, and beautiful things will always remain beautiful. And ugly things will become lovely. If one is young, one never grows old. If one is old, one becomes young. You see, Charming, I could not leave my kingdom without taking some of it with me.
Princess, he said, you can never need this water. I am an unhappy ambassador whose death you desire. Where you send me, I will go, though I know not if I shall return. And as Princess Goldilocks showed no sign of relenting, he started with his little dog for the gloomy cavern. Everyone he met on the way said, "What a pity that a handsome young man should throw away his life so carelessly. He is going to the cavern alone, though if he had 100 men with him he could not succeed. Why does a princess ask the impossible?" Charming said nothing, but he was very sad. When he was near the top of the hill, he dismounted to let his horse graze, while Frisk amused himself by chasing flies. Charming knew he could not be far from the gloomy caverns, and on looking about him he saw two hideous black rocks which came from thick smoke, followed in a moment by one of the dragons with fire blazing from its mouth. His body was yellow and green, and his claws scarlet, and his tail was so long that it lay in 100 coils. Frisk was so terrified at the sight that he did not know where to hide. Charming, quite determined to get the water or die, now drew his sword, and taking the crystal flask which pretty Goldilocks had given him to fill, said to Frisk, "I feel sure that I will never come back for this expedition. When I'm dead, go to the princess and tell her that her errand has cost me my life. Then find the king, my master, and relate all my adventures to him." And then as he spoke, he heard a voice calling, "Charming, Charming." "Who calls me?" he said. Then he saw an owl sitting in a hollow tree, who said to him,
You saved my life when I was caught in the net. Now I can repay you. Trust me with the flask, for I know all the ways of the gloomy cavern, and can fill it from the fountain of beauty.
Charming was only too glad to give her the flask, and she flitted into the cavern quite unnoticed by the dragons, and after some time returned with the flask, filled to the very brim with the sparkling water. Charming thanked her with all his heart, and joyfully hastened back to the town. He went straight to the palace and gave the flask to the princess, who had no further objections she could make. So she thanked Charming and ordered that preparations should be made for her departure. And they soon set out together. The princess found Charming such an agreeable companion that sometimes she said to him,
Why didn't we stay where we were? I could have made you king, and we should have been so happy.
but Charming only answered, "I could not done anything that would have vexed my master so much, even for a kingdom, or to please you, though I think you are beautiful as the sun." At last they reached the king's great city, and he came out to meet the princess, bringing magnificent presents. And the marriage was celebrated with great rejoicings. But Goldilocks was so fond of Charming that she could not be happy unless he was near her, and she always was singing his praises.
If it hadn't been for Charming, she said to the king, I should never have come here. You ought to be very much obliged to him, for he did the most impossible things and got me water from the Fountain of Beauty, so I can never grow old, and shall get prettier every year. I can't bat my eyelashes. Then Charming's enemies said to the king, It's a wonder that you are not jealous. The queen thinks there's nobody in the world like Charming. As if anybody you had sent could have done just as much. It is quite true, now that I come to think of it, said the king. Let him be chained hand and foot and thrown in the tower. Again. So they took Charming, and as a reward for having served the king so faithfully, he was shut up in the tower, where he only saw the jailer, who brought him a piece of black bread and a pitcher of water every day. However, little Frisk came to console him and told him all the news. When pretty Goldilocks heard what had happened, she threw herself at the king's feet and begged him to let Charming free. But the more she cried, the more angry he was. And at last she saw that it was useless to say any more, but it made her very sad. Then the king took it into his head that perhaps he was not handsome enough to please the Princess Goldilocks, and he thought that he would bathe his face in the waters from the Fountain of Beauty, which was in his flask on the shelf of the princess's room, where she had placed it so that she might see it often. Now, it happened that one of the princess's ladies was chasing a spider and had knocked the flask off the shelf and broken it, and every drop of the water had been spilt. Not knowing what to do, she had hastily swept away the pieces of crystal, and then she remembered seeing in the king's room a flask that looked almost exactly the same size and shape, also filled with sparkling water. So, without saying a word, she fetched it and put it on the queen's shelf. Now, the water in this flask, it was used in the kingdom for getting rid of troublesome people. Instead of having their heads cut off in the usual way, their faces were bathed in this water and they instantly fell asleep and never woke up. So when the king, thinking to improve his beauty, took the flask and sprinkled the water on his face, he fell asleep and no one could wake him. Little Frisk was the first to hear the news, and he ran to tell Charming, who sent him to beg the princess to not forget the poor prisoner. All the palace was in confusion on account of the king's death, but Tiny Frisk made his way through the crowd to the princess's side and said, Madam, do not forget poor Charming. Then she remembered all he had done for her, and without saying a word to anyone, went straight to the tower, with her own hands took off Charming's chains. Then, putting a golden crown upon his head and the royal mantle on his shoulders, she said, Come, faithful Charming, I make you king, and take you as my husband. Charming, once more free and happy, fell at her feet and thanked her for her gracious words. Everybody was delighted that he should be king, and the wedding took place at once. And it was the prettiest that can be imagined. And Prince Charming and Princess Goldilocks lived happily ever after. Yeah, so ever after, just not for today. Okay, I'm not gonna sing a song.
Don't get a copyright strike from me singing Into the Woods. That would be hilarious if they thought that was actually one of them. There in a casket, entirely of glass. Oh, I can't even sing the right song right. Besides, that's not my song anyway. Mine would be, hello, little girl, what's your rush? You're missing all the flowers. The sun won't set for hours. Take your time. Okay, let me see who we can raid. Who's on? There are like 2 or 3 different streams playing in my ears right now. Let's see. Don't want to raid the birthday girl. I guess I could, but who else is on? What? I'm gonna raid Shizu. Maybe. If I can get stuff done. If the raid thing will work. So. Raid commands. Raid messages I've got. Follower 1. I've got. Raid-S. Which is 1 for subscribers. And then raid. If it'll let me do it. Shizu. Yay, it works this time. Cool. So, all of the one of you that are possibly here, we're going to go raid Shizu. So, have a good night. I may try to play some games tomorrow. Haven't decided yet. I just want to get some of those stream days taken care of so I can get the emote spot, honestly. But, hey, I will see you all later. Have a good night, evening, morning, afternoon, whichever it may be. I don't know. Ta.